Welcome to the session of data entry process. In today's session, we will cover introduction to this data entry process, understanding the workflow, receipt, tracking, what are the different strategies, the considerations while doing the data entry, what are industry best practices around it, some guidelines, finally, post data entry, the kind of review to be done, and lastly, the distinction between paper and EDC data entries. The purpose of data entry process is to ensure the data are reliable, complete, accurate, of high quality, and it is suitable for statistical analysis. The data entry process encompasses the efficient receipt, tracking, entering, cleaning, coding, reconciliation, and transferring of data. A number of factors should be considered when choosing a data entry process, such as the skill level and the training that has been given to the personnel, and the amount of time that is allocated for data entry. Now, data entry can either be performed by data management team, as in cases of paper studies, or it could be done by the sites directly, as in cases of the remote data capture and the electronic data capture studies. With the electronic data capture systems, the traditional data management roles change. In most cases, the site personnel will do the data entry. They also have the capability to run the edit checks and make data updates to resolve the discrepancies. When data managers are not able to make edits, they need to remotely guide the site personnel through data cleaning processes. Now, these processes may take the form of automated checks, which are built into the computer system, or may operate through queries entered into the clinical data management system. When a study is EDC or a paper-based study, the functionality of the tools, the design of the study, and the skill sets of the staff should be carefully considered. Workflow processes for EDC studies will change as per the CDMS software that has been used. Therefore, these are highly dependent on the software developer as well as the organization's SOP. Let's understand the data entry workflow. So, although specific processes and steps may vary between organizations and studies, the flow of data should follow a logical, prescribed path. Now, the general workflow of data entry processes for studies using paper CRFs is presented here. And at each steps, there are the various choices that are available. All of these choices are described in the further slides. However, when the data are received, it should be first tracked, or it has to be logged. Then it has to be entered. After the entry, it has to be cleaned, and then it has to be subjected to various rigorous audit inspections or quality control. Now, to determine which choices are made to each stage of the workflow, this has to be decided by the organization, and therefore the organization should have standard operating procedures and data processing conventions. Data receipt. Now, data receipt process will vary across the clinical industry. Data could be received through fax transmission, regular emails, could be with express delivery, which has a tracking mechanism, or it could be private couriers. It could be hand delivered by the monitors. There could be an electronic web-based entry, or through other electronic means also, such as SFTP, that the data can be transferred. Now, regardless of the data acquisition mechanism, the process by which the data are received, confirmed as received, and even made available for data entry, this should be documented in the DMP. There are also standard operating procedures should be in place to ensure that the blinding of the subject identifying information remains, especially such as the name, address, subject initials. unless collection of this data has been authorized in the informed consent protocol as well as the local regulations. Otherwise, the blinding has to be maintained while doing this data transfer. Ensure that a process is in place to quickly identify also if there are incidences of the violation of the data privacy conventions and laws. If the CRFs are missing, then CRF missing reports should also be prepared for both paper and EDC-based studies to facilitate identifying forms that have not been received. Now, CRFs can be tracked by some of the means. The first one is the electronic data capture, computer-aided page checking, which results in a very higher integrity and efficiency than the manual process. Now, regardless of how the data received, procedures should facilitate timely, high-quality data processing. Expected visit date reports can be programmed into most reporting and tracking systems. By this, we will be able to follow the subject's progression throughout the clinical trial, as well as even predict when the subject will have their last visit. Paper tracking. Now, tracking may occur on an individual CRF basis or as per the modules. So ideally, when all the CRFs are tracked, data that is recorded on the paper forms are recorded in one of the two following fashions. Okay. The first one is the independent logging. In this approach, this involves personnel manually registering that study data and the data that has been received. Now, the data receipt may be recorded in the CDMS, although there could be other tracking mechanisms or systems in place as well. In a dependent logging, what happens is this is more of an automatic approach. So tracking happens automatically once the data has been entered in the CRF. So the good point about this approach is that it eliminates an extensive and expensive manual process of tracking the CRFs, replacing it with an electronic process in which tracking is a cost-free result of data entry. However, there is a trade-off that in any of the steps between the receipt and the entry, if the receipt dates are not accurate, then in that situation, tracking will become a problem. So for a reliable receipt dates, data should be entered when received with little to no backlog. The third one is the tracking third-party data. Third-party data such as laboratory data will be received electronically or on paper forms. Documented procedures should be in place to track data for each external data that are the various external data that are required in a study. Imaging and indexing CRFs. To provide added security and flexibility for paper-based studies, CRFs may be imaged and stored electronically in addition to storing the paper forms. CRFs should be scanned using well-established formats such as the PDF. The electronic files must be secured so they are only accessible to the authorized and trained personnel. File naming conventions should be very strictly followed, and repository of the CRF images should be indexed so that it allows to locate a specific file very quickly. What are some of the common data entry strategies? Data entry processes should address data quality needs of the study. The following ones is double data entry with a third person adjudication. Here, two people independently will enter the same data and a third person will resolve the discrepancies between the first and the second person's data entry independently. In a double data entry with a blind verification, again, two people will independently enter the same data and both will remain unaware of what the other person is entering. If the second person, when he enters the data and enters a value that differs from the first person, the operator will be warned by the system that there is a discrepancy. After this warning, the second data entry person, who is also responsible for verification, he must carefully examine the entry against the source and then determine what should be the appropriate entry before saving it. With this data entry strategy, the second entry person value will override the first person's entry value. In double data entry with an interactive verification, two people will independently enter the same data. The second data entry person will resolve the discrepancies that happens between the first and the second. But here, he will also be aware of what the first person is entering. He will not be blinded to the first person's entry value. Single data entry with a reviewer, where one person enters the data and the second person will review the data against source. There could be another one which is not recommended, but only a single entry is being done and the data is not reviewed. The data ideally will be reviewed subsequently by the data management team. The next one is the optical character recognition. This is a software which recognizes the characters from the paper forms as well as the faxed images, and then the data is directly fed into the database. But because this is software recognition, there has to be a manual review of whatever data has been entered by this software to ensure that there is accuracy of the data. What are some of the considerations to the data entry? There should be written procedures describing data flow, data entry, data processing, and quality levels to be maintained. The process and procedures should provide certainty to ensure the data from the source document is captured from appropriate analysis. Employees are trained on working on systems, procedures, guidelines, reference documents like medical abbreviations, so as to minimize any data entry errors. These documents should also be available to the personnel until the study closes out. All the employees have the required access as per their roles and responsibilities. Organizations usually should have a list of users to be maintained, which describes which user has what kind of access to the database. Organizations should also have quality checks to ensure that the data entered is accurate per the source document and it has been reviewed correctly by the DM team. A standard data entry convention also enables consistency of the data throughout the study. For example, if the study captures an entire date of birth, but the privacy laws of certain participating sites, the local laws of those sites, do not allow this complete date of birth collection, then based on the internal conventions that has been decided, there could be a default value for date and month can be added, and just the year of birth from the sites can be collected. This default value could be something such as 1st of June or 1st of Jan, followed by the actual date of birth, the year of birth of the subject. Automatic saving of the data by the system should be discouraged during data entry. This will allow the data entry operator to go back and check his work before he submits it. Paper CRFs and EDC screen parameters should be identical as much as possible to avoid any ambiguity or errors of data entry. Screen design should be such so as to minimize any data entry error. For example, use of coded checklists or selection options be applied, such as radio buttons and checkboxes. There can also be very clear instructions on the CRF screen of what should be selected. For example, if multiple checkboxes, multiple options can be selected, or just a single option selection is required. What are some of the industry best practices? The first one is address the purpose, characteristics, and complexity of each study in data entry training sessions, including but not limited to the review of protocol, scope of work, identification of critical variables, usually such as what are the subject identifiers, the primary and secondary efficacy variables, safety information, etc. Verify in a test environment, that is before the data entry system is placed into active use, that the entry field functions as they are planned. Example, like the date field will only accept dates. Drop-down list will only contain appropriate values. Okay. In some organizations, true test data pages may be entered for an entire case report form, while in some other organizations, they will focus on just certain few aspects of testing. This is not to be considered as a substitute of software validation or edit check testing. We have to train the team on completion guidelines to understand how data is ideally recorded, and on data entry guidelines for any specific data entry directions. To provide the site, sponsors, vendors, and study team members with timeline expectations for data receipt, tracking, and entry, turnaround time of the data queries, when the file transfers are expected, and the different database deliverables. The tracking mechanisms should be detailed for receipt of CRFs and other forms containing data to be entered. Tracking ensures that there is a control of the received records. Identification of any missing records is easier, and it also facilitates the archival of records at the end of the study. Quality control and assurance plan should be in place to address collection and review of the primary and secondary safety data. During active data entry, metrics and trends will help ensure that a stable and desired quality levels are consistently achieved within the study. A comprehensive change control process should be developed and maintained, which acts as a guidance to the team in cases of data updates. What are certain data entry guidelines? When either paper CRFs or an EDC system is in use, detailed data entry guidelines should be provided to all the data entry staff. All the data entry personnel should also be provided with the written documentation that should be received and understood by these people. Data entry guidelines may be a part of a broader user manual, particularly for studies using EDC systems. Both data entry guidelines and user manuals may take the form of paper documents or an online manual. The following topics should be considered for inclusion in the data entry guidelines or user manuals. Contact information of individuals available for troubleshooting of the computer problems and the hours when this help will be available. Instructions or conventions describing how to enter the data, delete data, respond to queries. Instructions or conventions describing how to enter data for single or multiple record panels. Reminders to users that a date time stamp and a username are recorded as a part of their audit trail for every record. The audit trail may not be visible depending on the system that they are using. Even if it is not visible, the audit trail must be readable by the inspectors and the auditors. This has to be clarified to them. Information on computer system security. Instruction on proper computer shutdown procedures to prevent any loss of data. Instruction on data entry personnel explaining appropriate actions when edit check triggers or reconciliation windows for double data entry system appears. Data review, data cleaning refers to a collection of activities used to ensure the completeness, validity, and accuracy of data. Data cleaning activities may include manual reviews of data, computer checks that identify inaccurate or invalid data using ranges, missing data, protocol violation, consistency checks, certain descriptive stats that reveals an unusual pattern in the data. Early in the study, data should be reviewed from several subjects at each site to help detect the problems with the data entry screens, which are not functioning as per the expectations, or because there's this lack of sites' understanding or compliance to the protocol. So following are the data cleaning activities to be performed: verifying that the raw data has been entered accurately in the computer, that the code list is valid, numeric ranges, there are reference ranges or normal ranges that get applied to the numeric values on submitting the values, identifying and eliminating any duplicate values, and the system flags if any critical or mandatory fields has any missing values. We're able to identify if the codes and the values are invalid. Usually there should be a warning or a pop-up message from the system indicating this. And also there should be a tracking mechanism which ensures that all CRFs that have been received were entered. For multi-forms related data, such as CONMEDs, related data, all the related data is received and they are entered. For example, if AE page is received, all the CONMEDs that were taken for each AE is also received. CRFs should have investigator comments for data anomalies. For example, if certain data is not falling within the protocol expected criteria or fails the logic of the checks, there should be an explanation why this discrepancy is the way it is, and it cannot be further rectified, and that it has to be acceptable as is. We should also ensure that the data which is entered are logical and consistent across the CRFs. That is, the way dates are reported, it should be logical and consistent. It should not be UK in one format and then US in another format, which completely changes months by their use. Okay, this could be just one example of logical data entry. Likewise, if it is required that height has to be written, has to be reported in vital signs page at every visit, ensure it's the same height that gets reported. Confirm inclusion of guidelines which are detailing the reconciliation of critical data, such as those that are mentioned here. Then there could also be range checks that could be designed to identify statistical outliers. These are values that are physiologically impossible or outside the normal variations for a population under study. Consistency checks can also be designed to identify potential data errors. For example, checking the sequential order of dates, corresponding events, missing data noted to exist elsewhere. Checks designed to identify protocol violations should be very closely monitored to allow timely actions that can be taken. A site can be monitored and investigated when stats or other checks indicate substantial differences from other sites. So in terms of performance, one site is not doing, is far different from the rest of the sites. Certain data cleaning distinctions. After entry and review are complete, flags or notes are generated outside the database for a paper-based study. And these are submitted in the individual data clarification forms. During data entry, and review by data management, these flags and notes may be compiled. The CRAs or the monitors can also create these during the monitoring. For data entry systems, such as remote data capture application, which allows only entry of data, flags or notes are identified by monitors, and they are treated similarly to paper. That is, data clarification forms are issued. For EDC systems, which shows data discrepancies on the screen in real time, this allows site to action on these sooner. Sometimes EDC will close these discrepancies automatically as soon as the data entry is done or the entry is corrected. But sometimes the screens will only allow manual closure of discrepancies. This is to allow a thorough review of the data change before the issue is closed. With respect to listings, cleaning listings differs from cleaning discrepancies, flags and notes that, because what happens is this will require a higher level of review by monitors, coders, statisticians, safety team, lab specialists. So when the review is being done on these listings, that's when all that information, all the data discrepancies are collated, and then a periodic data clarification form is sent to the site. However, for EDC, it becomes easier because there are program checks, auto checks that can be created to resolve the discrepancies. Then there are also listings that are created where external data such as labs, once they are received in-house, they are compared against the EDC data, and then the resulting listing will give the discrepancies, which are then queried within the EDC system in real time. Now, data may be changed as a result of data cleaning procedures, in which case the site and data entry, data center or sponsor must retain a record of all such changes. Data changes should be recorded and documented by a fax or an original site signature acknowledging the new data. This documentation is usually accomplished using a query or a data clarification form. In these cases, the site is expected to keep a record of the change within their study records. There could also be certain other updates, such as data cleaning conventions under some circumstances may be used. These cleaning conventions specify the data that can be modified without a site's acknowledgement. These are called as the self-evident corrections. And examples include appropriately qualified personnel correcting obvious spelling errors, converting values when units are provided, or there could be missing identifiers where the true values are obvious. Now, because the site must have a record of all the data changes, the site will also receive and maintain a copy of such versions of data conventions. Although it is strongly discouraged, situations do occasionally arise where telephone conversations with the site are utilized to authorize a data change. If this occurs, these changes should be clearly documented by the site who has authorized the change and the data center representative who was talking with the site. In this way, a record of the conversation and the authorization will exist at both the locations. In any case, any data change authorizations must be documented in writing, and they should be included in the study file for audit and inspection. Now, the different types of data changes that can happen in a paper-based and an EDC study. Entry changes or errors that can happen in a paper-based is system or process changes. They will be reflected in the data entry work instruction. Then changes will be reflected in the audit trail. And authorized changes are submitted by email and or phone. A hard copy has to be created for patient folders, both at the site and data management. So all the changes should be a part of our study file. For EDC, however, when changing the data, the EDC system will usually ask the user the reason for change. The reason for the change will be actually a part of the system's audit trail. For non-site personnel, data entry work instructions or conventions should be used as a documentation. Data clarification form updates. A hard copy of this DCF, which is approved by the site personnel, will be kept in the corresponding CRF pages at the site file. And because it's a DCF, which was issued by the DM team, it will also be a part of our DM file. In EDC, this becomes easier because queries are generated and they are a part of audit trail. So no additional filing is required as the EDC system captures all of this. Here in paper-based self-evident corrections, they should again also be documented. A self-evident correction instruction that is created for the study is also shared with all the parties involved in data handling. Here in EDC, self-evident corrections becomes a part of your electronic audit trail. So obviously with the audit trails, username and the roles, it becomes very easy to understand if it was a site personnel or it was a sponsor CRO personnel who was making these changes. Site-initiated changes should be documented through a manual data clarification form. So if site is also initiating any data changes proactively, then that has to be also requested through a data clarification form. This could be resulting in a data update, or it could be simply an explanation or a new update over an existing data. In EDC, all of that becomes a part of the audit trail because the new information, whatever it is in the form of comments, in the form of data updates, gets captured in the system's audit trail. Okay, so welcome to the second part of the data entry process. And here we will understand a little more in detail about the overview of the process and what does it all contain. So the first part is understanding the data collection. From where exactly does the data come in? We will now understand the entire process and each bit of it, each steps involved in the process. The data collection will be first from the source data. Data will be collected from a variety of sources, which includes your patient medical records. That is, once when the subject visits the site and the investigators perform the different kind of protocol assessments, those information will be present. Then you will also have the samples being drawn from them, and then those samples will have their reports. This could be just not biochemistry, hematology, ECG. It could be certain imaging scans. There could also be tumor samples collected, their results as well. Then you will also have the investigational product logs. Now, what is this investigational product logs talking about? So, apologize. So what is this investigational product log? When the patients are being given the different kind of investigational products or the treatments which are under research, these are being accounted for, especially if you have oral investigational product, the ones that are to be given in form of oral tablets or capsules. Now, these are to be accounted for. So there's a bottle that will be given to them, and then probably between the visits, they have to take that dose daily or as the cadence is described in the protocol. So when they come to the site the next time, there is going to be an accounting of how many doses were taken. And that will be that will be determined through the number of tablets or capsules that still remain in the IP bottle. Okay, so how many bottles were given, or how versus how many did the subject come back with, and then what happened with the remaining doses. All of that information is going into this IP product log. Okay, so this is the, I apologize, this is the one that we are talking about. The investigational product logs. Then is the patient diaries. Now, what are we expecting in the patient diaries? The patient diaries would consist of every day how it is that the patient feels. So these diaries will be a part of the subject, and the patient or the subject will have to monitor themselves during the visits, between the visits, when they are back home. And then as and when they feel something, so if they feel a certain symptom, if they feel certain pain or some kind of abnormality, so all of that would be a part of these patient diaries. You will also have certain other trial related information also coming in. So these will be the ones that will be a part of your data collection. Then you also have, when you say other trial related documents, you can also have, let's say, physician notes, which could be serving as an additional information for updating certain data in the CRF. Then comes the actual case report forms. Now, these are the standardized forms which are created across the industry, and usually the organizations will have standards developed to have these CRFs in place. The CRFs will have the data collection points which are created as per the protocol requirements, and then basis those specific data points, that data will be collected from the subjects and from the sites. Then you also have the patient reported forms. Now, the patient reported outcomes, okay, or in some cases, it's also called as the ECOA, or the clinical outcome assessments. Now, these are all the symptoms assessments, quality of life questionnaires, whether then there are certain questionnaires which check the suicidal tendency. So these are all psychometric tests. And this gives additional information of how does the patient feel when he is in that during the trial and they are taking actively this IP. Okay, so it measures a lot of assessments. So even if there are certain visual analog scales which measures the degree of pain that the subject feels when they are at home, okay, in between the visits. So those are again patient reported. So that could be one. Another one could be certain other urticaria, let's say, for example, the degree of how often or what is the intensity of that. So there are various such scales. There are various questionnaires which the patient themselves answer. And that information again becomes very vital for the trial. Okay. Now it can be in the form of ePro, which will be electronic devices. Some of these questionnaires or symptoms assessments are basically you will have the handheld devices, okay, or these electronic devices which are attached to the body of the subject or the patient. And then it takes continuous readings. And then these are like via cloud services. It's being directly reached to the vendor, and then the vendor gives a consolidated file of how exactly the subject was feeling throughout the day. So it's like the data is a continuous data. And then you also have paper forms wherein there will be paper questionnaires which will be given to the subject, and the subject is expected to complete them as they come across that respective assessment or the pain or the trigger to complete that paper form. So this is all about data collection. So once the data is collected, the next thing is there should be a preparation for data entry. Now, how are the preparations made? Now, typically there will be a data dictionary. A data dictionary is going to define how the structure of the database should be, uh, what kind of variable names will be expected, uh, what are the different data types that will be expected, and the permissible values. So basically, if it will tell you um, whether weight has to be collected in pounds or it has to be collected in kilograms, it has to be reported in kilograms, or if there is a specific value where decimal values are expected, then after decimals, how many values are to be entered. Okay, which of the data points it is okay to report in whole numbers, which of the data points require decimal numbers, then what kind of variables are expected. So whether it is blood plasma, it is hemoglobin from the blood or hemoglobin from the plasma, what kind of data type it is, which are the different variable names that will be expected. So is it going to be a AE start date only, or it has to be AE start date as well as the start time? So all of these variables, these data dictionaries has to be available so that when the person who is doing the data entry is aware of what needs to be selected and how data needs to be entered. When these standard dictionaries are created, it ensures that different sites, global sites, or people who are doing entries from different site data, all of them are entered with a specific consistency. Then comes your data entry guidelines. Now, in this, again, very, very critical because it gives the data entry personnel understanding of how the data has to be entered, right? And then which are the data points which will be auto-derived. That is, I have to fill the data at some other data point, and once I complete that, the next data point would automatically be will automatically appear. The system is going to generate the response to that data point. Then, in case if I do not have any information as a data entry person, okay, my source information is, or if I'm a site personnel and I know that this particular assessment was not performed, or I do not have the response for this particular assessment, and I do not expect it also in the future, then how do I represent that data in the CRF? Will there be, should there be a comment in the CRF that should explain this? Should I, or are there any other ways and means of updating the information? So in electronic eCRFs, there will be not done, not applicable data points available. You will also have the comment bubble, which will give them more information. They can also expect that certain queries would come in, and when the queries come in, they're supposed to respond to those. So the data entry guideline is going to be very specific in telling you what is expected. In cases if a data entry requires updates, you need to update the value that you have already submitted. Then again, electronic eCRFs, there are a standard process. How do you update the data? Whether you need to strike through it, when you use an eraser icon to delete the data, then submit the information, then try to enter again. So a lot of those general instructions on how to complete and update an existing information within the CRF, the data entry guidelines is going to speak about it. Preparations are done. Now comes the actual data entry. Now, it could be done by a manual entry wherein the data entry personnel who is collecting the information, that is the site, could probably enter the data directly in the eCRF into the EDC system, or alternatively, they will update it in the paper CRF, send the paper CRFs to the data management team, and data managers will then, the data entry personnel within the DM team would do the actual entry into the EDC. Now, there are various means and methods of data entry, which we have looked in the previous slides. There's double data entry, again, where the second person who does the entry, data entry, would be looking at it, or it could also be the second person not doing it, two persons are doing it simultaneously, and there will be a third independent reviewer who's going to check if what is the correct value whenever there is a discrepancy between the first entry and the second entry. This independent reviewer is then going to make sure. Then you would also have certain verification checks. So EDC systems will often have certain built-in checks. That is, during the data entry itself, if you'll make an error, the system is going to pop up messages that this is not acceptable, and it will not let you submit the data. That will be one kind of verification check. Another will be as soon as you submit a data which is incorrect and which fails the logic of the checks, there will be certain queries that will fire on the screen. And that will be a visual indicator that something in the data is not correct and that you need to update it. Now, after this is so, what kind of these verification checks could be? Now, the examples that are given here is the values are not within the predefined limits. That is, let's say you're updating a blood pressure value for systolic blood pressure. So if you enter a value which is outside the acceptable range, then obviously there will be a query firing that the systolic blood pressure is high or lower from the range of low and high. That's one kind of a check. Then another one will be consistency check. So a consistency check would be, say, for example, it is expected that the study ECG has to be taken in the same position at all visits. And if you see that in the previous visit, the subject was standing and now he is sleeping. It was first in the upright position and now it is in the supine position again, that's going to be a disconnect. So there will be a query that will be firing. So it will compare the previous ECG visit with the current visit and check the details of what the position was when the ECG examination was being done. There will be also certain logics checks which will identify any contradictory data. So for example, let's say your CRF design is such that the pregnancy form will stay irrespective of whether the subject is a male or a female. Now, if that happens, then there has to be a check. So if the subject is a male and if the pregnancy form is completed, there should be a query that should fire. So this is going to check. So this is a logical kind of a check. Another one, after all the data entries done, comes the actual data review and query generation. Now here, the data review is the clinical data managers. Okay, they are going to do the review along with clinical data managers. Nowadays, we also have the medical monitoring team who will review certain specific set of data. You will also have centralized monitoring reviewing some kind of data. Safety team will review some kind of data. And if there are adjudicators who are aligned to the study, who look into the specific data endpoints, critical endpoints, then they would be also looking at certain information. So the data review basically happens by a lot of people that the sponsor is working closely with. And then these clinical data managers, monitors, they will review the enter data and check if it is complete. That's all the data is present. The data that is present is accurate and consistent. If they identify any data discrepancies, so this happens mostly after the data entry is completed. So completion, it's the data is submitted, and then it may be the next day or some days that this review is going to be done. So when this data review is being done, there will be queries that will be issued to understand and or explanations would be sought for that discrepant data. These will be sent to the investigational site for resolution. So site personnel will respond to the queries and they will clarify the data or they will correct the data as requested. Your data cleaning. Now, data cleaning again involves data validation and query resolution. Data validation involves like a series of procedures so that they ensure that the quality of the data as per the industry standard remains or as agreed with the sponsor. Now, this would be involving regularly on a regular basis. You keep looking at the data and identify if there are errors. They are also reconciling data across different sources. So you will have your third-party vendors who would come in and they would compare the data. Then there will be safety information, safety database information, which will be compared with the CRF data. So these are different sources against which then patient information, patient reported outcomes will be stored in with the vendor who is providing the patient reported outcomes to you. Okay, so the vendor who is maintaining the ePro devices or the questionnaires, they are the ones who will provide this data, and that again has to be compared for the logical discrepancies. So this will be then verified then again against the source data. When the monitors are performing the source data verification, source data review, there will be certain discrepancies identified, which again will be queried. So this is like an ongoing process throughout the study conduct phase. As a result of this data validation, there will be queries also issued. And as required, if there are queries issued, the sites will answer them and the data managers and the respective other teams will be involved in closing these queries, ensuring that the resolution has happened correctly. Where resolutions were not provided and it is an acceptable, irresolvable discrepancies, then there has to be a documentation of explanation maintained, which can be referred at the end of the study. So this is like an ongoing process, and then this goes on throughout the conduct phase of the study. So once the conduct phase of the study is completed, then comes your database lock. Now your database lock will be towards the end of the study when all the subjects are completed. The protocol target of whatever has been the target that has been reached, or the threshold of the protocol has been reached. Like let's say a protocol would say that it checks the survival rate. So when the survival rate is less than when there are X number of deaths that happen in the study, the protocol would stop recruiting. So if that happens, then after that, there will be data cleaning processes done and the database would be locked. Likewise, if it's an investigational product, which has to be administered, let's say for a year. So once all the subjects reach the threshold of 1 year of dosing, the study is going to stop. Okay, so once this happens, till the time that last subject has taken the last dose, okay, that happens, and then data cleaning processes are still being done. There will be one final data cleaning, and after that, the database would be locked. When we say a database is locked, it's basically to ensure that data that has been collected thus far, cleaned thus far, okay, No further changes should be made to the data, and there is therefore an integrity in the data sets that will be taken up by the biostatisticians for analysis. The data, after this is being done, the database log activities are performed, then is the data export being done. The data from the from the CRF, that is being exported out in the form of data sets. These data sets will then be analyzed by the statistical analysis team, and they will be responding and they will be generating the results and the reports. Then comes, after data has been analyzed, now comes the archival part. Archiving of the data is important long-term storage, because finally these data sets may have made the results of the study, or how the results were being performed, or how the data was collected. This will be used as a reference in the future for some other exploratory points, or for some newer studies that will be built on the fundamentals of this existing study. So there is usually an industry standard, but the sponsors also have an internal archival period once the study is locked. Audit trail maintenance, that is throughout the data entry process, because every time you make an edit or you make an entry into the EDC, there has to be a stamp. It has to be registered in the EDC system. That is, at any point of time, there cannot be any update which is not tracked. Every entry, every update, every query will be tracked through the audit trail. Therefore, your systems, every system should ensure that audit trail compliances is in place and audit trail mechanism is in place. Then, regulatory compliance point of view, all the data entry processes and procedures, they should be documented, how these were being done as per the regulatory compliance. So your data management plan should talk a lot about data entry. If there are separate data entry guidelines created for certain sponsors, those should be in place and they should be followed. There should be compliance with the written procedure. Now, it is important that the industry guideline of 21 CFR Part 11 is applied when electronic records such as eCRFs are used for data entry. So that was the overall process of data entry. Okay. Effective data entry in clinical research is essential for producing reliable and high quality clinical trial results. So it involves rigorous quality control measures, adhering to the SOPs of the organization, as well as a very close collaboration between the DE person who is performing the data entry. In our cases, in EDC cases, it's usually the site personnel. Then clinical data managers and monitors should coordinate very well so that we ensure that the data accuracy and integrity is maintained. Now, data entry is a very critical process in clinical trial, whoever does it, be it the DM team or the site team. And it's essential that to ensure the accuracy, completeness, and consistency of the data, it's important that we maintain the accuracy, completeness, and consistency. But there will be several issues that can arise during the data entry process, which will impact the data quality and the overall success of your clinical trial. So some of the common issues we've already mentioned here on the slide. Data entry issues. You will have typographical errors. They will make mistakes. Data entry personnel will make mistakes while typing, which will lead to certain incorrect values or data inconsistencies. Then transcription errors, which occurs when transferring the data from source documents to the EDC system or the case report forms. So incorrect copying. Data entry omissions. Data entry omissions will be where inadvertently or some of the information has been omitted while entering the data, which leads to incomplete data sets. Then the next one could be inconsistent data entry, wherein you use certain non-standard abbreviations, which may not be understood by anybody who is reading the data. Okay. Then unit conversions are you fail to convert the units correctly. That is, if the data was reported in pounds, let's say by the site, but the CRF expects that the weight has to be in kilograms. So that conversion from the units from pounds to kilograms, if that is not done correctly, then that could result in data inconsistencies. Then there will be date format. Incorrect date formats can be challenging to analyze any time-related information. Specifically, if let's say the date is different regions have different ways of reporting the date. So maybe the site in UK is reporting the date in the format that's more acceptable in UK, which is DDMMYY format. But the data entry personnel resides in US and is more accustomed to MMDDYY format. So if they misinterpret that data, the date format, there could be a huge difference in the data analysis. Then comes your missing data. Again, there will be non-compliance where site does not follow the data entry instruction, and that would lead to missing or incomplete data points. And this often happens where they don't read the entry guidelines and then they update the information. An example would be action taken with IP. Now, action taken with IP cannot be not applicable if the subject is still on IP, he comes to visits every time, and he is taking the IP. Not applicable option has to be collected only if the subject is off IP. He is either because he is in the drug interruption period, or let's say he is in the follow-up period where the treatment is already completed. And at that time, if there is an AE that happens, then action taken with IP can be not applicable. Now, your data entry guideline is telling this very clearly. But if the data entry personnel is not aware of this, they may end up putting not applicable even if the subject is on IP in between visits. Then patient non-response. Patients may fail to complete the certain assessments or questionnaires, which results in missing data. Often this happens in the patient-reported outcomes where they fail to be compliant and update the information correctly. Then data integrity and validation. In data integrity and validation, we are talking about integrity checks. If these checks are not built correctly, then that could lead to an inaccurate or invalid data entry, which will never be caught. Then logical errors, where there is error in the programming validation checks, which will result in false positives or negatives, leading to even incorrect query generation. So the logic is incorrect. So even if the data is updated correctly, you will have queries firing, and there will be sites who will update the data as per the query just to get rid of the query. So that could also lead to certain logical errors. The next one is data entry delays. Now, data entry delays would basically talk about sites not entering the data in correctly, or the data entry personnel is also not updating the data as soon as it's received. And that could lead to data backlog. So there could be data backlog. Okay, there could be data backlog. It could even result in potential inaccuracies, especially if it's a time-sensitive data which is involved. So if it's complex oncology trials where immediate actions are to be taken basis the data that has been already collected, if there is a delay in the data entry, then these things cannot be done timely. Decisions cannot be taken because the data is unavailable. Then comes your inadequate SDV. Inadequate SDV. Now, SDV means basically source data verification, where the source is compared against your EDC entered data to see if these two are matching or not. If CRA does not perform this activity correctly, there will be discrepancies in the eCRF which are not matching with the source and can result in discrepancies going unnoticed. Data breaches. That is inadequate data security measures so that it exposes sensitive patient data to different breaches and unauthorized accesses. Okay. That means even the person who is entering the data, utmost care has to be taken about whether the person is authorized to do the right kind of data entry, and only the person who is authorized does the data entry. There is no exchange of passwords, and there is no third person involved who does data entry. That can be one kind of data breach. Also, it could also result is because many a times the data entry personnel has access to patient information such as patient name. So that could lead to data. If this is data security measures are not in place, we might violate data privacy laws, and the data and personal patient information becomes available. People will already know who the person is, and that can again lead to non-compliance. Then there is lack of training, that is insufficient training for the data entry person, leads to errors and obviously non-compliance with the data entry standards as well as the protocols. And then you have the regulatory compliances where non-compliance is with the 21 CFR Part 11, which will have a failure to comply with the electronic record keeping and electronic signature regulations, which will lead to certain regulatory issues. Now, what are some of the ways to address those issues that we just noticed in the previous two slides? Clinical research organizations have implemented robust data management processes and quality control measures. The first one is SOPs, or the standard operating procedures. And every organization will have their clear SOPs, which will help them for data entry, validation, and query resolution. Then once you have these SOPs, important to ensure that people are trained on it and there are certifications. So they are well certified. And only once you are trained and you have the certification in place, you get access to the systems. That's how usually the organizations work. You will also have the data validation checks, which will ensure that even if data entry person accidentally makes an error, there are enough validation checks in this EDC system to catch the the logical errors. There will be real-time data entry oversight, which is monitoring the data entry processes in real time to identify and correct any errors promptly. It is good to have regular audits. Now, regular audits will help in the sense conducting audits will assess the data quality, also helps to keep in check with the data entry standards are compliant and were followed. Data entry and query management, implementing efficient data cleaning and query management procedures, regularly to check the data entered. There should always be timelines for data entry. Usually, there's a timeline given of 5 days for the sites and the data entry personnel once the information is available. This ensures that there is no data entry lag most of the times, and then we have data available as real time as possible. Then securing the data is the data that has been received, entered, it is secured, is stored correctly, and then it's being protected enough. There are enough security measures to ensure there is no data breaches or leaks of data. Then regulatory adherence. Adhering to the regulatory requirements is guidelines which are related to data management. We follow the data management guidelines. Addressing these issues proactively and maintaining data quality throughout the clinical trial process is crucial for ensuring the integrity of the trial results and the regulatory compliance. And these are some of the key guidelines which control data entry in the clinical research industry. The first one is the ICH E6 GCP, International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use. E6 is a globally recognized guideline that outlines the standards for the conduct of clinical trials, including data entry and data management. It emphasizes the importance of accurate and reliable data collection and documentation. 21 CFR Part 11. The Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, often referred to as Part 11, sets forth the requirements for electronic records and electronic signatures in the US. It governs the electronic system use in clinical research, which includes data entry to ensure data integrity and security. We also have the FDA guidance on the computerized system used in clinical trial. This guidance will emphasize on the importance of validation of the system, audit trails, and security of the data. The EMA guidelines, which is the European Medicines Agency, this provides the guidelines on various aspects of clinical research, like data management, and EDC, which is electronic data capture. They outline requirements for data quality, traceability of the data, which again is audit trail in a sense, and electronic signatures. And finally, we have the CDISC standards, which are we developed global data standards for clinical research. So one of those is C-, which is Clinical Data Acquisition Standards Harmonization. And then we have another one is SDTM, which is Study Data Tabulation Model. It provides guidance on data collection, organization, and submission. We also have the ISO 14155, which is clinical investigation of medical devices for human subjects. This provides guidance on clinical investigations, includes recommendation for data collection in management in medical device trials. We also need to look at some of the local regulatory requirements, which along with the international requirements, depending upon which country the clinical trial is taking place. So irrespective of even if it's a global trial, if your site is present on a specific country where additional local laws are applicable, then these also need to be followed. Sponsor-specific standard operating procedures is usually the sponsors develop their own SOPs and they govern the data entry practices within the organization. So if CROs are being used, then CRO SOPs would be used. But if data management and data entry is done by the sponsor company themselves, then they will have their own SOPs governing these. They are to ensure that these SOPs are consistent and they're compliant with the actual regulatory requirements, like the ones that we saw, like the FDA, the EMA, right? Then we have the DMPs, very, very essential, which will talk about, it's a very comprehensive document, details out how the data will be collected, entered, validated, timelines for data entry, management of the data throughout the clinical trial. Now, they are developed again in accordance with the regulatory compliances, the guidelines that we talked about, and they are the most common document for reference when it comes to data entry as well as data management overall. There has to be data entry training and certification. So regulatory agencies will often require that personnel involved in the data entry are adequately trained and they're certified for their roles. There are training programs and certifications which ensure that individuals understand the guidelines and the procedure. Now, these guidelines and regulations overall are designed to maintain data quality, protect patient safety, and ensure the reliability of the clinical trial results. Organizations conducting clinical research are responsible for adhering to these standards and for establishing robust data management processes to meet the regulatory requirements. Now, here are some of the quality control processes for transitioning from paper data entry to electronic data entry. And these are crucial for data accuracy, consistency, and integrity. Some of the key QC activities to consider when moving from paper-based data entry to EDC are: first is data entry validation, which involves data which is entered into the EDC system matches that of the paper CRFs. So there's verification of patient IDs, ensuring that the subject ID, date of birth matches between the paper and the EDC. There can also be certain data consistency checks. So the data consistency checks would talk about that the data is entered correctly as per certain predefined rules, for example, age calculations, unit conversions, etc. Then comes your double data entry. Parallel data entry would happen. Two independent data entry personnel will enter the same data into the EDC system. And if there are discrepancies between the two, they will be flagged for review and resolution. So either a third person will do the resolution or the second data entry person is going to make the final review and resolution. Then you have the SDV. Now, SDV would be comparison of with the source document and verifying that data which is entered into the EDC is correctly done. Then we have the data query management, which will talk about what kind of queries that will be generated once the data has been entered. Then there will be a query resolution, which will ensure timely resolution of the data queries through the communications with the site personnel as well as documenting of the responses. Then during the data entry itself, there will be range checks, logical checks, which implementation of the validation rules. Usually companies will set up certain validation rules within the EDC system itself to identify any data outliers or inconsistencies. Then review of and resolution. This involves resolving the data discrepancies, which were a result of your validation rules. Total data review and monitoring, which will be ongoing, conducting ongoing reviews of the data. And this is going to identify data entry errors or inconsistency checks. So range checks and logical checks may be applied just at the time of data entry, and then these queries will fire, and then they could be even accidentally closed. Okay. Or sometimes what happens is sites may make one entry, and when the query fires, they will update the information. As soon as the query is closed, they again revert the original values which led to the query. So therefore, ongoing review of the data is absolutely essential. And this ensures that the data is constantly being checked for any logical errors. Then we have the audit trail, which will track the changes and the access to data. Training and compliance of the users. This will ensure that the personnel who are trained in the data into the EDC system are adequately trained and competent in using the system. Then there is also user access control, where it's important for every organizations to maintain the access controls, do a level of authorized checks frequently, keep checking if the right people have the right kind of accesses, and those who are no longer part of those projects, their accesses are being revoked. Data cleaning and cleaning logs. Now here again, ensuring that processes for data cleaning are completely developed well, they have been well documented, and they are version controlled. And then the logs that are being used for data cleaning. So there will be various trackers, reports that will be created. Those are also being maintained. Electronic signatures, part of 21 CFR Part 11 requirement, ensuring that data is approved and there is a proper sign-off. Documentation and reporting, where whenever quality checks are being performed, there is a documentation that the quality check was being performed. And it includes a detailed documentation of how the validation process was, what is the query resolution, as well as the audit trails. There also should be QC reports that can be generated to track the progress and outcomes of the QC activities. Regulatory compliances is adhering to the regulatory requirements and ensuring that the guidelines being followed. And lastly, most importantly, a constant user feedback should be given and continuous improvement so that the systems can be upgraded basis those feedbacks, okay? And then any kind of issues that are encountered, there are improvements that can be created within the EDC systems. Then there can also be improvements by regular sharing of the different kind of QC process feedbacks. You can develop better processes so that there are lesser errors introduced right at the beginning. And with this, we have taken care of data entry in great detail. Thank you. With this, we come to an session's end for data entry. If as a CDM personnel, we are allowed or we are asked to perform the data entry, going through the organization's SOP is very critical. Understanding the system functionality with respect to data entry, what kind of responsibilities are being extended to us, whether self-evident corrections are applicable. All of these aspects are to be clarified before beginning the data entry. Thank you very much.